Story 1. The Call of Room 13. That night, the hospital was quieter than usual. Fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting unsettling shadows across the empty corridors. Nurse Laura, accustomed to the silence of the early hours, felt something different in the air, a heaviness she couldn't explain. As she walked down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoed, breaking the oppressive silence. She tried to ignore the chill running down her spine, but something inside her knew that this night would be different, and not in a good way. When the phone at the nurse's station rang, Laura nearly jumped out of her skin. It was 3:33 a.m., the time when, they say, the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. With trembling hands, she answered. On the other end of the line, a weak and raspy voice whispered, "Help, room 13." Laura's heart raced. Room 13 had been closed for years, ever since the tragic death of a patient no one could forget. Her mind refused to believe it. Curiosity got the better of her. Without thinking twice, she grabbed her keys and headed to the room. As she approached room 13, the air seemed to grow thicker, colder. Laura felt as if she were being watched, but when she looked around, there was no one there. The corridor was empty, except for the shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. The sound of light footsteps followed her, but when she turned, only emptiness stared back. Every step she took toward the door of room 13 was a test of her courage. Something was wrong, very wrong, but it was too late to turn back. When the key turned in the rusty lock of room 13, a sharp, piercing sound echoed down the hallway. The door creaked open, revealing a dense darkness. Laura hesitated for a second before stepping inside. The room smelled of mold and something indescribable. She could almost feel the air pulsing, as if the room were alive. As she turned on the light, a figure stood in the corner, facing away from her. Laura held her breath, her heart pounding erratically. When the figure slowly turned, a pale, empty face stared back at her. She recognized the patient. He shouldn't have been there. After all, he had been dead for a long time. Laura felt panic rise within her. The figure didn't move, just observed her with eyes that seemed like bottomless pits. Then, in an almost inaudible whisper, he spoke. "Why did you let me die?" The memory came back like a bolt of lightning. That patient had been hers. On that fateful night years ago, she was supposed to check his vital signs, but she got distracted by another emergency. When she returned, it was too late. The guilt had eaten at her ever since, but she never imagined he would blame her from beyond the grave. The figure took a step toward her, and Laura backed away, desperately trying to remember that he wasn't real. The pain in her chest was very real. The spirit was there to collect the debt. Then Laura fainted. When Laura's colleagues arrived for the morning shift, they found the door to room 13, open but empty. Laura's body was sprawled on the floor at the nurse's station. In her hand, she clutched the station phone, as if she had tried to call for help. They administered emergency care to Laura. She regained consciousness, but not forget what had happened the night before. From that day on, no one wanted to work the night shift at the hospital. Room 13 was locked forever, but some said they could still hear the phone ringing at 3:33 a.m. And whoever answered it was never the same again. Story 2. The Watchman of the Abandoned Factory. It was Carlos's first night as a watchman at the old abandoned factory, a massive, imposing building that had once been full of life, but was now deserted, filled with forgotten memories and worn-out walls. The locals avoided the place, talking about strange sounds and lights that flickered on their own. But Carlos, needing the job, didn't pay attention to the stories. Armed only with a flashlight and a communication radio, he began his rounds through the vast, silent corridors. The echo of his footsteps seemed to follow his movements, as if something invisible were marching alongside him. And in that sepulchral silence, an unsettling feeling began to settle in. As he walked through the corridors, Carlos heard a high-pitched, metallic sound coming from one of the oldest areas of the factory. The sound of machinery was something he didn't expect to hear in a place that had been shut down for so long. Intrigued, he followed the sound until he reached the tool sector. There, he found an old hydraulic press, rusted and covered in dust, moving on its own, as if operated by invisible hand. Carlos's heart raced. He tried to turn off the machine. The controls didn't respond. The sound of the gears seemed to get louder, more intense, until suddenly, everything stopped. Silence returned, but the feeling that he wasn't alone only grew stronger. After the incident in the tool room, Carlos decided it would be wise to stay more alert. He was patrolling the administrative area, where the windows, covered in dust and soot, still offered a ghostly view of the external yard. As he looked out the window, trying to calm his nerves, he caught a glimpse of a figure outside in the darkness. Carlos froze. It was impossible for someone to be out there, but he was sure of what he saw, a tall, thin, almost skeletal figure that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. He ran outside, but there was nothing, only the wind whispering through the metal structures. He wasn't imagining things. Or was he? The next day, Carlos decided to investigate the factory's history. He went to the local library and discovered something that made his skin crawl. Years ago, the factory had been the scene of a terrible accident. Fire had engulfed the building during the night, trapping several workers inside. Many died burned, and some bodies were never found. Tragedy was hushed up, and the factory was shut down shortly after. Carlos couldn't shake the thought. The noises and apparitions he had witnessed might be linked to these dark events. Figure in the window? Could it be one of the workers who died there, now trapped between this world and the next? Back at the factory that night, Carlos felt more anxious than ever. He couldn't forget what he had read. As he made his rounds, he heard the metallic sound again, but this time it was different. It was stronger, more frantic. He followed the sound, which led him to the old forge, an area he had not yet explored. When he entered, the air was dense, heavy with the smell of iron and soot. In the center of the room, he saw the same figure he had glimpsed through the window. Now, in the dim light, he could see more clearly. It was a man, or what was left of him, with gray, almost translucent skin and empty eyes. Carlos tried to move, but he was paralyzed with fear. The figure turned to him and, with a distorted voice full of pain, murmured something he couldn't understand. Then, as if completing some kind of macabre ritual, the figure simply vanished, leaving Carlos alone in the darkness, with only the sound of the machines that should never have worked again. Carlos quit the job the next day, without looking back. He knew that something terrible inhabited that factory, something that didn't belong to this world. No one else took the watchman's position after him, and the factory was officially sealed off, deemed too dangerous for anyone to enter. However, the rumors continued. People swore they heard metallic noises coming from inside the building, especially during the darkest nights. And occasionally, a figure was seen peering through the dirty windows, as if still waiting for someone who would never return. Story 3. Spirit of the Library. The city library had always been a haven of tranquility, a place where people went to escape the noise of the outside world. For the librarian Marcos, working there at night was a privilege. He enjoyed the solitude, absolute silence broken only by the occasional sound of a page being turned. But that night, silence had a different quality, almost suffocating. As he was organizing the books, he heard something that shouldn't have been there. Whispers. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing among the shelves. Marcos stopped, holding a book in his hands, trying to identify the source of the sound. His heart began to beat faster, but he forced himself to believe it was just fatigue playing tricks on his mind. However, the whispers didn't stop. On the contrary, they seemed to be getting closer. Following the whispers, Marcos found himself in the history section, where the oldest books were kept. It was an area rarely visited, making it even stranger that he found a book out of place, lying on the floor. Cover was dark leather, with worn edges and no title. Intrigued, he picked it up and began to leaf through it. The pages were yellowed, almost disintegrating at the touch. The writing was dense, in a language he didn't recognize. When he turned to the last page, he noticed something disturbing. A mark, like a bloody fingerprint, seemed to have been left by someone who had held it tightly. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the library, extinguishing the lights. Marcos felt that something was terribly wrong with that book, but when he tried to return it to the shelf, his hand hesitated, as if some invisible force were stopping him. In the dark, the library seemed to transform. The sound of light footsteps echoed among the shelves, but Marcos was sure he was the only one there. He tried to calm his nerves, telling himself it was just the wind or maybe the old building settling. But then something moved beside him. Turning quickly, he glimpsed an indistinct figure, feminine shadow hovering between the shelves, almost translucent. The figure seemed to be watching him, but when he blinked, disappeared. Marcos's heart pounded like a drum, and he began to walk backward, keeping his eyes fixed on the spot where the shadow had been. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. Desperate to understand what was happening, Marcos decided to investigate the origin of the book. He spent hours researching the library's old archives until he found a record about a woman accused of witchcraft in the 17th century. She had been captured and executed, but before she died, she had cursed a book she had written herself. It was believed that anyone who read her words would be condemned to see her spirit and bear the burden, her vengeance. Marcos realized he had made a terrible mistake by opening that book. The woman he had seen was not a simple apparition, but the spirit of the witch, trapped between two worlds, seeking her revenge. Marcos knew he needed to get rid of the book, but how? Destroying something so old seemed impossible, and returning it to the shelf no longer felt like an option. As he wrestled with the decision, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The woman's figure began to appear more frequently, closer each time, more real. She seemed to be waiting, impatient, or something. Marcos felt he was running out of time. With each passing minute, her presence grew stronger, more oppressive. He tried to leave the library, but the door was inexplicably locked. There was no escape. He was trapped, with the only option being to confront the spirit and find a way to end the curse. Finally, in an act of desperation, Marcos decided that the only way to rid himself of the curse was to burn the book. He ran to the maintenance area, grabbed a can of gasoline, and returned to the history section. With trembling hands, he doused the book in the flammable liquid and struck a match. The flame danced for a moment, illuminating the shelves before he threw it onto the book. But before the fire could spread, the woman's figure appeared before him, now fully formed, with eyes full of rage. The fire began to spread, but her presence didn't retreat. Instead, she advanced on Marcos, enveloping him in a cold darkness. The last sound he heard was her whisper in his ear. Final curse before everything went black. When the firefighters arrived to put out the fire, they found only ashes and an intact book in the middle of the debris, as if the flames had never touched it. Then Marcos woke up. He had fallen asleep during the quiet night shift. Confused by what he had just seen, he convinced himself that it had been just a nightmare. But every night after the incident, he was haunted by the image of the woman until he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital with suspected schizophrenia. You found these stories terrifying. Get ready, because the worst is yet to come. This was just the first part of the dark mysteries that the night shift hides. Don't miss the continuation, where we will reveal even more disturbing secrets that will keep you up all night. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. Are you ready for what's next?